Hi, Matt.
How's it going?
Oh, not too bad for a June day in Washington, D.C. It's the temperature's under 100, the humidity's under 90. It's great.
Yeah, no, lovely. Thanks for being with us here today.
My pleasure. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, just for the audience's informational purposes, you're the policy director at the Democratic Leadership Council. Do I have that right?
Yeah, basically. Vice President for Policy is my phony baloney title, but yeah, that's basically what I am.
I had it insufficiently grandiose there. I apologize.
It's called getting old.
Sure. I could use some title inflation myself, I think.
Well, how about senior fellow? That always works.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, that's not bad. Although, we actually haven't been doing an issue this month here at the American Prospect. It's one of our skip months. So I've had plenty of time to work on long-term projects like watching soccer games in the middle of the day. World Cup fever is taking grips here.
A low-grade fever. Yeah, it's a low-grade fever. It is kind of hilarious. It's a quadrennial phenomenon that Americans very briefly focus on soccer every World Cup if the American team is competitive, and then they quickly and happily forget about the sport for 4 years afterwards. So, in essence, they're allowed to substitute their sort of routine ignorance about most American sports with a truly systematic and joyful ignorance about a sport they know nothing about, so long as they're able to hoot USA at the television set when our team's doing well. I guess by the time this goes up, America will be playing for its life against Ghana tomorrow. So by the time
I'm, as I speak, trying to work myself into passionate hatred of all things Ghanaian.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure.
Well,
because
is there some sort of
show that liberals can be patriots too?
Do they have any yellow cake uranium there? Is there some national security case we can make against the Ghanaians?
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm afraid I have only the vaguest sense of where Ghana is. Near Nigeria, I think, right?
West Africa, yeah. That's
West
about
Africa.
I mean,
somewhere in the neighborhood. I mean, it's been my feeling that due to the rise of the blogosphere and Frank Foer taking over at the New Republic, a kind of soccer polarization has kind of gripped the internet with
yes.
Injecting a lot of this into the political world, and then I've seen some vicious denunciations of soccer, also in his magazine in Slate. Whereas I have very, very mixed feelings about the whole thing. Soccer strikes me as like it's an okay sport.
An okay sport.
Yeah, that's what I think. I'm trying to find a wise middle ground. I like proper American football better, but I think it's better than baseball.
Or are you a sports unilateralist? Is that what you're suggesting? Because soccer is clearly connected with globalization and with multilateral organizations like FIFA. So
sure.
I think any patriotic American is going to be a little suspicious of that, right?
Well, this is true. Although I should say, one of the things you always hear in the quadrennial World Cup hype is that everywhere outside the United States, this is like the biggest deal ever. And in my experience, at least the one other place I was really at during the World Cup was Russia in 1998. And if anything, people seem to care even less about soccer than they do here, since
really?
On the one hand, Russians don't watch a lot of soccer, and on the other hand, they just don't have the kind of commercial sports television cable networks to hype them into everything.
Yeah, but it's a great opportunity to drink, which yes, I think is the national pastime of Russia. I hate to engage in cultural stereotypes, but having a pretty reliable information that is the national pastime there.
It is, but they're sufficiently committed to it that I don't think they actually feel the need to develop a pretext.
I see. And it's hard to develop that into a competitive sport unless it's, do Russians have drinking games?
They just kind of drink. Well, at one point, I played a drinking game there where what happens is a bunch of guys stand in a circle, and you drink a shot of vodka, and then another one, and then another one, and you keep doing it until you fall down.
And the last one standing gets what, a bottle of vodka?
Well, he wins. I don't know
okay.
why.
Can you remember?
I was passed out by the time the game ended, so I didn't quite see what happened.
Yeah, I was just wondering if they watch, President Putin on television and, every time he evokes the spirit of Peter the Great, you take another shot. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it could be fun. But I think there's a connection then between soccer and military weakness, basically. The global superpowers seem to be bad at it, and rising countries like China and India are nowhere to be found, and instead it's all about Paraguay and so forth. Perhaps we should keep on eschewing it.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty wise. It's always great when you get into athletic competition to have a win-win proposition. If we win, we're the best. If we lose, we're the best. So I think you're on very safe ground. And again, more likely than not, a week from now, Americans will have forgotten there's any such sport, except those with children who are warehoused in soccer leagues every Saturday.
Yes. I mean, the really troubling thing, though, is that soccer aside, I think we lost the Olympic basketball a couple years ago, and then just earlier this year, there was this international baseball tournament organized. Which I think,
yes.
Nobody even considered the possibility that we might lose, and we didn't even make it to the final rounds. So, basically the Bush years, I think, have seen a kind of a perilous decline in the quality of American sports competition. And that may be the most damning thing one could say about his administration.
It could be, though. I'm sure this fall the Republican talking points will suggest that you not look at the record but consider the dire alternative offered by Democrats.
Sure.
In which we will not qualify for the World Cup under a Democratic administration, right? I mean, after all, where were we in soccer when Jimmy Carter was president?
That's true. It was terrible. It's terrible.
Yeah, we've got to remember these things. And
this will let us transition to topic 2.
Yes.
Which is that, the old conventional wisdom was that Bush was like the most conservative president ever. Then Bush got unpopular, and coincidentally or not, all of a sudden lots of conservatives were saying he wasn't a conservative at all.
Of course.
And then last week there was some pushback on that. Semi-coincidentally, a John Chait article in the New Republic and an Alan Wolf article in the Washington Monthly, trying to say that this is conservatism. That's what we're watching, right?
Yeah, I actually linked to both articles in my own blog, New Donkey. I really thought Alan Wolf not only nailed it in terms of the relationship to George W. Bush and conservatism, but made a much deeper point about the relationship of conservatism and governing in the United States. It's a fairly simple point that a lot of people miss, which is that if you don't believe that government has a positive role in national life, particularly domestically, yet you are unwilling to significantly pare back government in a way that the American people won't accept, then you have a tendency to treat government as a gigantic jobs program and political slush fund for targeted constituencies, your contributors, the business community, and so forth. So conservatism, in this country at least, inherently breeds incompetence and corruption in government. If you don't believe...
Once it abandons a real effort to try and pare things back.
Well, they do that pretty damn fast, in my experience. People look back at the Reagan years, and you read about this huge revolutionary attempt to radically reduce the size of government in Reagan's first budget. Being an old guy, I was kind of there, and it wasn't terribly radical, and they gave up pretty fast. And, the same thing after the 1994 revolution. How quickly did they abandon efforts to abolish federal agencies? And then, most notably under George W. Bush, in which any kind of even vague commitment to spending restraint went out the window right away. I mean, to me, the least known important point about George W. Bush's presidency is that this man has yet to issue the first presidential veto.
Sure.
It's unbelievable. Clinton had about 80 by this time in his administration. Every other president has too.
Yeah.
He could very well be the first president in American history to leave office with, other than William Henry Harrison, who died after a month, to never issue a presidential veto, and that's over 2 terms.
He's congenial.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I will say I liked Alan Wolf's theory because it sort of ties things together nicely. But the counter evidence, I would say, is that Bush's running of foreign and national security policy also seems to be shot through with cronyism and corruption, and for example, the use of the coalition provisional authority as a kind of patronage mill for Republicans, and conservatives are supposed to believe in defense policy.
Well, they're supposed to believe in a strong national defense. I do think that is probably the weakest part of Wolf's argument. His contention is that Rumsfeld's handling of the war in Iraq shows the same kind of bad government on the cheat tendencies that they show in domestic policy, and an obsession with privatization, even of core government functions like national security. Hence the enormous effort to cut contractors into so-called reconstruction in Iraq, which of course has never really happened. And I hadn't really thought about it that way because, like you, I sort of assumed that the one thing conservatives did care about is national defense. And like a lot of people, I've been astonished at the fundamental incompetence of the Pentagon under Rumsfeld, and really attributed this more than anything else to Bush's inability to admit mistakes or hold people accountable for bad performance.
Sure.
I think Wolf makes a pretty good case that that even in national security, conservative ideology, shies away from anything that involves sustained public effort, and that has been the hallmark of Bush policy, really, in the war on terror generally, and specifically in Iraq. That's why, the disdain for any kind of nation building, the disdain for anything on the civilian side, the assumption that you can go in, overthrow a regime, and it will take care of itself.
Sure.
It does indicate a rather frivolous attitude towards public functions that may well extend to national security. And I think the other point, obviously, is that the conservative tradition in this country in national security is a little incoherent to begin with. You have an isolationist party that became the anti-communist Cold War internationalist party.
Sure.
And obviously conservatives have been, I think even more than liberals, a bit in the wilderness after the end of the Cold War. And their supposed rediscovery of a national security doctrine after 9/11, I think, is increasingly suspect.
Right. Well, no, I mean, there's a sort of schizophrenic nationalism, but not I think a real idea.
No.
As to what it is that they want to do.
There's a little.
I mean, you've seen that as soon as the project has run into difficulty in Iraq, right? There's just nothing.
Well,
we're going to stay.
And it's worth remembering that the primary national security goal of the entire Republican Party prior to 9/11 was missile defense.
Sure, with missile defense and maybe China.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, the Yellow Peril. So, I do not concede that today's conservatives have a particularly coherent, doctrine of for national security, in the fight against jihadism or anything else. They simply sound that way. They are a little more disciplined, and they're stuck with a record that they can't do a whole lot about.
Right. But I will say this on behalf of the theory that Bush is not a quote unquote a real conservative, is that I do think that people on the left sometimes neglect the significance of the sort of rhetorical shifts that Bush has made from the way Reagan talked about things. You'll hear from people, well, that's just rhetoric. Compassion sounds nice, but where's the beef? And all that's correct. But I mean, I think there's a real political significance in the way that not only have Republicans stopped really trying to pare down the government, but they just don't talk in the way the Reagan era Republicans did. You don't hear things like, government is the problem, that kind of thing. There's a much more, at least in terms of political positioning and how they want to be viewed, much more, at least pretending that they do see a positive role for government in American life.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think what's really happened is that, and I think some of our progressive friends who have nothing but disdain for the Clinton administration need to understand this, that what happened during the 1990s is that, partly as a result of what happened in the 1980s, sort of the perceived excesses of the New Deal, Great Society, welfare state were addressed. And confidence in government, though still not very high, has certainly rose significantly during the 1990s. And particularly when contrasted with the Gingrich Republican efforts to sort of ham-handedly dismantle core domestic government functions, which were highly unpopular, I think the whole context for talking about government and its excess has changed by the time Bush ran for president in 2000.
No, I think that's just right. That there was a lot of fear from people on the left of the Democratic Party that what Clinton was doing was going to just shift the debate even further right.
Yeah, some of them still believe that
of the role of government, but actually he was very successful in rehabilitating the idea that at least most of the actually. Refocusing people on the existence of these programs that they liked and eliminating the sense that, this was like an out-of-control entity that was taking their money and primarily giving it to people they didn't like. And that it's been an underappreciated achievement, especially since I think when you think about it, all factions of the party could draw some support for what they think from just recognizing what Clinton was able to achieve there.
Part of the reason the incompetence of the Bush administration is so notable and so politically important is that, most people sort of remember that they felt a lot better about government in the 1990s. It was actually getting results, problems that we thought were unsolvable, like welfare dependency and violent crime rates and teen pregnancy, all got better. A lot of people actually remember that. And I know politics and elections are about the future, not the past. But I do think, I don't think that long has gone by that Democrats shouldn't sort of remind people that government is not an end in itself that's either inherently good or bad. It's an instrument for solving problems. If you solve them, that's good. If you don't, that's bad. It's pretty elemental. But I think the broader point about Wolf's piece, and it's something that not just us shattering class types ought to pay attention to, is that in the debate among progressives as to how to characterize what this Republican Party and this administration has become, is it about ideology or is it about competence? It's both. Sure. I think we need to say that these people stand for the proposition that you spend a couple of $1 trillion a year on a government you don't like, don't believe in, has no particular mission, that you're probably not going to do it very well. And that there is a connection between the use of government to reward entrenched privilege and partisan behavior and campaign contributors, that's a pattern that runs throughout the Republican Party in Congress and in the administration. It's not an accident. And here's what's really going to matter, Matt, is in 2008, let's say that, Bush isn't going to run again. And certainly the polls show that his brother ain't going to get the nomination either. Democrats are not going to be able to run against the Bush record quite the way they could have in 2004 had we done that. And we're going to have to make the case that there's something a little deeper going on here than sort of a clueless president who can't admit mistakes and let his underlings kind of go crazy. We're going to have to make that case.
Okay. Well, I agree. So from Bush's alleged apostasy to Joe Lieberman's. I wrote a while ago, back in early 2005, about what was then nascent movements to mount a primary challenge to Lieberman. And, as it happened, right, the period when I was working on the piece was a time when it looked like Lieberman was flirting with the idea of trying to strike some kind of bargain with the White House on Social Security. And it struck me at that time that if Lieberman did that, then I could really see a challenge, because that was something that the party leadership had tried really hard to get everyone unified on, that there were sort of major interest groups behind. It was really a big deal. Then Lieberman didn't do that. This talk sort of died down for a little while. And then when Ned Lamont started up, even though really I'm not much of a fan of Joe Lieberman's, it struck me as, both quixotic and a little undermotivated, despite my complaints. But you, I think, are a more robust Lieberman fan than I.
Well, I used to adore the man. He was chairman of the organization I worked for 5.5 years. A lot of his recent behavior and a lot of his policy positions, particularly on Iraq, I don't agree with.
Sure.
I do think he has shown, since he ran for president in 2004, some serious political shortcomings. But having said all that, to me, I just find it very odd and self-destructive that there is a national, and it is national, it's not really that much Connecticut-based, no matter what happens in the primary, there's a national effort to purge Joe Lieberman, primarily because of his position on Iraq, which I don't agree with, but an effort to call him some sort of, quasi-Republican or conservative Democrat, really based on that one issue and on a strange sort of mischaracterization of his record on domestic issues, and even his performance in the 2000 elections. There's an odd revisionist history going on, that just isn't borne out by his voting record or what actually happened in 2000. And to me, it shows that I really do wish those that are really working overtime to take down Joe Lieberman would admit that it's mostly about Iraq, and that it's also an effort to intimidate Democrats who are not for a very strong let's get out now position on Iraq into silence or unity. Again, I'm an old guy. I remember when the Democratic Party, you don't have to agree that quickly, man. But, I can remember when the Democratic Party included, an incredible ideological array. People that were genuinely conservative, big C conservative, called themselves that. We have more ideological unity in each of the two parties than we've had in the entire history of the United States right now. It strikes me as a peculiar time to start administering strict litmus tests on foreign policy or anything else. A Democratic Party that, it really tells you a lot that a guy like Joe Lieberman, who after all votes with Democrats in the Senate about 90% of the time, about as much as anybody else, is being treated like he's Zell Miller, an apostate. And I have to say this, Matt.
Sure.
I know Zell Miller. I worked for Zell Miller. And Joe Lieberman is no Zell Miller. He has not taken himself out of. He has not taken himself out of the Democratic Party.
What struck me talking to people and reading them. You said you wished that the anti-Lieberman movement would admit that this is all about Iraq. But I actually kind of get the sense. I sort of feel like they would be better off if they said that. Lieberman's position on Iraq is going to be very, very unpopular with primary voters in, the Connecticut Democratic primary, and that, it's unpopular with, say, me. And I could see basing the movement that way. But they say, and I've come to believe them, that this isn't really about Lieberman's voting record, which, as everyone admits once they look at it, and that it's a fact that I even first learned on a Daily Cause post years and years ago. Lieberman's voting record is much more in line with the Democratic mainstream than you would think, and seemingly he's a much more orthodox Democrat than he likes to portray himself as, almost. And what bugs people about him is basically more his media appearances than his votes, right? I mean, he has a tendency to he has a sort of friendly relationship with some elements of the ideologically conservative press, and tends to say things about other Democrats or the left wing of the party that people feel sort of reinforces conservative political strategies. Which seems to be primarily what upsets people.
I think it may be more the friendliness towards the other side than any hostility towards his own party that seems to be the real problem here. I don't think he has some sort of systemic pattern of attacking other Democrats. I mean, people go back to his failed presidential campaign and say, oh, my God, he said nasty things about Howard Dean. It was a nominating contest.
Oh, sure.
I mean, all the candidates said negative things about each other. That's what you do. And, there is this odd sort of theory that's particularly prevalent in the blogosphere that I've never quite bought, which is that somehow, I understand the basic reasoning, but I think it's carried way too far, that if a Democratic politician appears on Fox News or writes something in the Wall Street Journal, that somehow translates into votes for Republicans. Yes, we do need to understand that and I'm not sure Joe Lieberman does, by the way, that we live in a not just a polarized political atmosphere right now. It's one that was engineered very deliberately by Karl Rove and the Republican Party, and that we can't play by the same old rules we used to. And I think in some respects Joe Lieberman is a throwback to the pre-polarization politics when you generally tried to have friendly relations with the opposition. You might actually have some close friendships. You might even agree with them on one or two issues, as Joe Lieberman has. But you really did need to understand that we've got to choose up sides and fight. And I think that a lot of that is the basis for the hostility to Lieberman. But this idea that somehow Joe Lieberman is having some huge impact on Democratic prospects nationally, or that is helping the Republicans actively when he agrees with Bush on Iraq, to me is just hallucinatory. How does that translate into votes for the other side?
He's become a symbol. Right. I mean, for the increased polarization and for the idea that there are Democrats who don't get it, right?
Yeah,
who don't understand how the modern world, how the contemporary scene works. And he's symbolically that, and of course it's important that he represents Connecticut, right? I mean, people, there's a tendency, but people cut Ben Nelson a lot of slack that he wouldn't get if he was representing Connecticut or Washington or some other reasonably solid Democratic state.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another theory about Lieberman that I don't quite understand, particularly coming from Netroots types who say this isn't about ideology. The planet axiom in what you just said is that, well, of course, everybody should be Bernie Sanders. That's the right thing to be. You really, if you're going to be a good Democrat, you have to be systematically progressive according to whoever's yardstick. You have to, in other words, you have to get as far to the left as you possibly can while still winning elections. Therefore, it's okay that Ben Nelson strays, but it's not okay that Joe Lieberman strays, because Connecticut would support a Bernie Sanders. I mean, I think we need to.
I think even more it's attitudinally. I mean, maybe not everyone needs to be Bernie Sanders, but maybe. People from solidly Democratic states should all be, more like Chuck Schumer, say.
Yeah, well,
who's not the most left-wing person, but who's incredibly feisty and ceaselessly, trying to win, right? Whereas if you're in a mostly Republican state, obviously you're going to want to emphasize your ability to work with Republicans, that you're not a dogmatic partisan, blah, blah, blah. But if you're in a majority Democratic state, even if you have disagreements on the issues, there doesn't seem to me to be a reason why you can't be, playing for the team all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, let me make it clear. I wish Joe Lieberman were a little more partisan. I don't agree with him on Iraq. I do think he's sort of a throwback to a bygone era of bipartisanship, which the other side has pretty much discarded, though not completely in the Senate. But having said that, I think his alleged sins against the fighting spirit have just been blown way, way, way out of proportion. And my fear for the National Democratic Party is that instead of being a symbol of, democratic heterodoxy, what happens to him is going to become a symbol of democratic intolerance. It's really funny. A lot of Lieberman's detractors seem to assume that he's Karl Rove's best friend in the, in the Senate, and George W. Bush's best friend. I think the Republicans are dying for Joe Lieberman to go down in this primary. Not simply because the whole theory of polarization is about eliminating any kind of middle ground. If you're an extremist ideological Republican Party, the only way you're going to build a majority is by convincing people that the other side's even more extreme than you are, right? You don't want to actually change your policies. You certainly don't want to compromise with anybody. They're incapable of that. So I think they'd love to see Joe Lieberman go down, and I think that will reinforce their argument, if it happens, going into 2008, that, you may think that we're a little crazy, but look at these other guys. They can't even, they don't even have room in their tent for a guy like Joe Lieberman, who was their vice presidential candidate in 2000. That's what I worry about.
I sort of share that fear, but on the other hand, part of my basis of that fear is that and this is part of the critique of Joe Lieberman, is that I think if Joe Lieberman loses, we can probably expect him to, write op-eds for the Wall Street Journal making exactly that Republican argument about the Democratic Party.
I don't know.
In some ways, I guess I do feel, it's the old principle that you'd rather have someone inside the tent pissing out.
I do. I also worry that our friends in the Netroots, and some of them really are my friends, are going to, if they can take down Lieberman in this primary, they're going to start looking for some other targets.
Then the war widens.
Yeah, and you hear that kind of talk all the time. Maybe Steny Hoyer's next, and then ultimately, of course, the big target is going to be Hillary Clinton. And I think it will breed a lot more a toxic infighting within the Democratic Party at a time when we don't really need that, and B, will encourage this sort of distortion of politicians' records that I think is going on in the Lieberman case. It makes me crazy. Look, the bankruptcy bill that was enacted last year, I didn't like it. I blogged, said it was a bad idea. But people in the Netroots are acting like that legislation is more important than, say, Bush's tax cuts or the budget.
Sure.
Because they're looking for reasons to describe Democrats that they don't like, often over Iraq policy, as heretics on a whole wide range of issues. And I just think we need to be, a little more balanced and honest about what it means to be a progressive, and recognize that this party, even with its Ben Nelsons and its Joe Liebermans, is a whole lot more united and more ideologically consistent than it's ever been in the history of the country. And I'll just keep saying it until maybe I get a few nodding heads among the Netroots types that they understand that maybe we need to be more disciplined than we are right now, but it's not like that's our basic problem.
Okay. But the Netroots do, at least some prominent Netroots persons, seem to enjoy the Mark Warner a great deal, even though he appears to be, not that they're by any means identical, but a centrist politician in, if not the Joe Lieberman mold, more perhaps the Bill Clinton mold, a sort of modernizing Southern governor in the center, has some ties with your outfit, but also burgeoning ties with the blogosphere, which he's obviously decided to try and put an unusually large amount of effort into courting. despite the oft thought extremism of the netroots.
Yeah, well, I mean, those of us who have been watching Warner and watching the netroots for a while, it's pretty clear that Warner has, he hired Jerome Armstrong, one of the founders of MyDD, and he's also very close to the Coase world, as his internet outreach director, which was a very smart thing to do. He did make an appearance at the yearly Coase conference in Las Vegas through a pretty lavish party. It makes a lot of sense for him, actually, and what's interesting to me about it is that he's done this sort of outreach without in any way taking policy positions that you think would be naturally attractive to netroots folks. I mean, Mark Warner talks more about bipartisan.
Well, I did promise that we wouldn't talk about network neutrality, but
oh my God.
One subtle thing he's done is put network neutrality stuff up, which is not to talk about the issue, but it's smart politics, right? I mean, this is something that nobody cares about except for bloggers who care about it enormously. So you can take a position that they're happy about, and nobody else is even going to notice. You don't need to put it in your stump speech, whatever.
Yeah, well, let's remember that Mark Warner is a very successful former tech executive. He knows the world and those issues probably better than anybody else in national politics. And there is another legitimate thing about Warner that's beyond outreach to the netroots that I think they find attractive, which is that he's a former governor. He is not tainted with identification with the legendary D.C. political establishment, and of course he didn't have to vote on the Iraq War resolution.
Sure.
All of which gives him a degree of flexibility. And I do think that the netroots types do sort of like a winner, and they're impressed by what he was able to accomplish in Virginia. But again, from an ideological point of view, yeah, he's pretty much you want to use labels, DLC centrist, and he a lot of people in our part of the party find him pretty attractive too. I think the other thing this whole saga of Warner's support in the netroots shows, and you understand this very well, is that the whole progressive blogosphere is still a very personal place. There really are a small number of people that manage these big sites. They know each other. They have personal relationships. Who they support affects who their friends support. I mean, to read progressive blogs these days, you would really think that the political epicenter of the world is Montana. That John Tester's primary victory in Montana a couple of weeks ago was the most important political event of the year.
Sure.
And that Brian Schweitzer is, a legitimate candidate for president of the United States. Now, why is that?
He's the second coming.
Well, half these guys live there.
Back to Warner.
So it's personal. And that's okay.
Right. Boring and substantive, old school labor liberal Nathan Newman did a post on Warner, partially in response to me just wondering, I've been saying that I thought Mark Warner was like the great idea of a candidate. If I was describing the generic attributes I would want someone to have, having a background as a successful tech businessman, and then the governor of a potentially winnable large southern state, sounded great to me. But I could never quite figure out what Mark Warner thought about anything. Nathan Newman wrote this kind of critique of the Warner vision of sort of bringing tech jobs as a way of raising living standards. Nathan said that of course that's good. New jobs are good. Education is good. But just made the point that I do feel that sort of centrist Democrats tend to be insensitive to, which is just that we, no matter what the government does, 20, 30 years from now, whenever, we're not all going to be computer programmers or cell phone company executives. Lots of people are going to be janitors or hospital orderlies or landscapers or, building houses, so on and so forth. And, any kind of strategy we have for shared economic growth and whatever, needs to address the concerns of those kinds of people, and not just be endlessly focused on education and training.
Well, I think Nathan, and I think you might have just done it too, kind of misstated what Mark Warner talked about, particularly in Southwest Virginia when he ran for governor. It's not, I'm going to bring you tech jobs. It's, or even that, education levels are going to insulate you from global economic change. It's not all what he said. He said that that building a technological infrastructure in rural parts of the country can help revive traditional industries, can help salvage jobs and even whole industries that are currently non-competitive globally, and that we don't need to treat traditional industries or the people that work in them or the people who do not have advanced education as just globalization's losers, and there's not much we can do about it other than give them government benefits. It's a point of view about the importance of technology that I think a lot of people, not just on the left, but certainly Republicans, have missed altogether. And that's exactly what he talked about over and over and over again, that places like Southwest Virginia can actually do better than suburban or urban areas if they have a technological infrastructure that makes it possible for capital to move into areas that were previously capital starved. It's a fairly sophisticated economic argument, which I don't think Nathan made at all. But Mark Warner certainly didn't say to people in Southwest Virginia, you're kind of screwed, but maybe your grandchildren, if we build a better education system, can have a decent life as a software engineer. It's not what he said at all. And I do think I'm a little bit alarmed.
That sounds a lot better to me.
I'm a little bit alarmed that that in fact Nathan Newman in the Post you talk about referred to this whole education and training theory as the DLC big lie. I think there's a mischaracterization of Clinton's position on this whole subject of what he used to call expanding the winner's circle, and a sort of a cavalier dismissal of education and training is frankly irrelevant. That the only thing we can do is sort of blunt government action to protect jobs from global competition, which I guess is what Nathan. Is what Nathan has in mind.
I wouldn't dismiss education and training and
or technology.
I wouldn't mischaracterize what things Mark Warner said, because I don't know, and if Nathan was wrong, the view you described seemed a lot.
So this is what Mark Warner said
to me, but it is true that there's a certain strain of Democrat who, at a minimum, always seems to lead with education as the solution to economic problems. And while I think everybody thinks education is great. I heard Paul Krugman speaking the other day, and he was just making the point that if you look at where inequality has really taken off of inside inside the economic spectrum, it's been huge growth in a tiny elite. Not even, not like the top 20% have been taking off, the top 2% or 0.2%.
Yeah.
And education just isn't going to address those kind of phenomena in political economy, and a lot of us would...
I agree.
Not that we're against education, but we would feel better if we heard a little bit less about it, because that would indicate that there was some desire to take action on other kinds of fronts.
Well, I think this is kind of a dialogue of the deaf, because I do think that centrist Democrats, when they talk about this whole issue, talk about a lot of things other than education and training. The DLC's chairman, Governor Tom Vilsack of Iowa, talks about competitiveness strategy, incessantly, and it includes education and training, but it also includes things like beefing up the ability to organize unions and bargain collectively. It includes a lot.
Probably
includes
the most, I think, to build bridges on this one.
Well, but again, technology seems to have dropped out of the argument too. We've got a national administration that's disinvesting, the country in the kind of technological innovation that I think everybody concedes had something to do with the hypergrowth of the 1990s. It gets back to things like our national energy strategy. The economy of this country, its economic future, depends on the United States, maintaining and developing a lead in clean energy technologies. I think almost any economist will tell you that. We have a national government that doesn't even care about that, doesn't even believe in any kind of coherent national energy strategy. That's part of what centrist Democrats talk about when they talk about how we're going to develop high-paying jobs for all Americans of the future, regardless of their education levels. How we're going to address the inequality that you talked about, which bothers me as much as it does anybody else, and how we can get back to the kind of sustained, broad-based economic growth we had in the 90s. I think there's a very simple narrative that we have on the difference between R's and D's on the economy. I mean, the kind of economic boom we have right now, so-called, is the best Republicans can imagine. It's precisely the kind of economic boom we had in the 1980s. It was preceded and succeeded by a deep recession. It was characterized by gross inequality. This is how they like it. It's the best they can do. It's the absolute best you're ever going to get under a Republican administration. But I do think, and this gets back to the very first thing we talked about in this conversation, that we kind of need to remember what worked in the 90s, Americans do, and not just toss all that away as some sort of failed romance with the tech world or globalization. It's not what Democrats stood for then, and we shouldn't throw it away. Particularly because I'm not sure that I don't know what alternative vision Democrats can really offer on the economy unless it's just systematic opposition to globalization, which I don't think voters accept. I think they know that we have to adjust.
All right. Well, see, I have a sophisticated, nuanced take on that, but I also said we'd try and keep this down to around 45 minutes.
Okay.
So that everyone can move on with their lives.
Watch soccer.
We should wrap up here.
Okay. Yeah, it's time to get back to soccer.
Sure. Yes. Exactly. All right. Well, goodbye. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks to you, Matt. Hope to do it again.